The Future of Power, der Geopolitik-Podcast von Agora Strategy.
Herzlich willkommen zur 26. Folge unseres Podcasts The Future of Power, der Geopolitik-Podcast von Agora Strategy. Mein Name ist Timo Blenk und ich bin Partner und CEO der Agora Strategy Group. Titel der heutigen Folge ist Control Center Kremlin, Strategy, War and the Global Chessboard. Und ich freue mich über einen sehr besonderen Gast heute, Alexander Gabuev, Senior Advisor bei Agora Strategy und Director des Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Und aus diesem Grunde findet die heutige Folge auch auf Englisch statt. Dear Sasha, thank you very much for taking the time and be welcome to our podcast session.
Vielen Dank für die Einladung. Also die Folge ist heute auf Englisch, nicht Deutsch, deswegen reden wir Englisch.
I might consider switching back actually when I listen to you, but
let's stay in English. I feel a little bit more comfortable, but probably next time will be auf Deutsch.
We do that every year now, so we'll be fine. Sasha, let me briefly introduce you to our listeners. You are not only a senior advisor of Agora Strategy, but you are also the director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center here in Berlin. And before that, you've actually led different projects and teams at the Carnegie Moscow Center based in Russia. But this was shut down by the Kremlin actually in 2022. So you've relocated to Berlin. You have a very strong research focus on the Sino-Russian relations and foreign policy, especially, of course, regarding the situation in Ukraine and Russian domestic politics, Chinese domestic politics, etc. And you've written on these issues for a number of institutions, but also, for example, extensively for the Financial Times, The Economist, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal. So pick your favorite. And you've also been a journalist in Russia, so you really know very well what you're talking about. So I very much look forward to our discussion today. We're going to discuss, on the one hand, Chinese-Russian relations, and on the other hand, Russian domestic policies. So let us start directly with one of the key questions. Let's look forward to the next years, 2030. Where do you see Russia? Who is in power? And will the war in Ukraine still be ongoing?
I think it's contingent. And if anybody tells you that he or she has a crystal ball, I would be very skeptical. Multiple people, including myself, have been wrong throughout the last 3 years on some issues. I think that I unfortunately have been generally more or less on the point on many issues and be cautious about predictions. But I think that we are entering a very wild period of volatility because there is a disruptor in charge. Now is Commander-in-Chief of the United States, and that's Donald Trump. And I think that his presidency is really historic. And the dynamics of his presidency, the internal domestic situation in the US, his foreign policy will affect us all, including the situation of Russia. So this is the unpredictability factor there. There are some trend lines, and that would lead me to predict that by 2030, most likely the name of the ruler of Russia will still be Vladimir Putin. He will still be in the Kremlin and around, probably grooming his succession, but he prefers to hold his cards very close to his chest. He knows that once you designate a successor in such leader-centric system, you become somewhat of a lame duck. His experience watching the transition in Kazakhstan, where former President Nursultan Nazarbayev has been sidelined, but his very loyal successor, is proving him the point that you don't need to really pick one because other elite groups will be just rallying around this new guy. So it's Putin. I think that the country will be poorer overall, less prosperous, more dependent on China, more repressive. Hopefully war in Ukraine will be over, but then how Ukraine will look like by 2030, I think, is one of the major puzzles right now. And I think that currently the trend lines are pretty grim for Ukraine, unfortunately.
So were you disappointed that actually 24 hours after Trump's inauguration, the war was still ongoing?
I didn't expect that. I think that if you push me against the wall and force me to make a prediction for this year, and again, that's a very awkward prediction, and I don't want to be pushed against the wall. It would be that the war will continue this year for a bulk of this year. And the deal in 100 years and so on seems to be elusive. Or if there is a deal agreed between Trump and Putin and rammed down President Volodymyr Zelensky's throat, that's not going to be a deal that's good for Ukraine. There is no ideal deal for Ukraine that would be in line with President Zelensky's aspirational and also justified goals for restoring the principle of international law, reclaiming Ukrainian internationally recognized territory in 1991 borders, including Crimea and so on. That's off the table. That's been off the table for quite some time, if not entirely. But many crucial elements of the deal, particularly Western security guarantees for Ukraine to maintain its sovereignty and independence, that's exactly what Vladimir Putin will try to undo in his negotiations with Trump. And what Trump's position will be is everybody's guess. I don't think that the president has outlined what his preferences are.
All right, since we're already talking about this, can there actually be a deal between the US and Russia specifically on Ukraine? Or will it be, if there's a deal, always a deal more on the general European-US position at global scale, so that Russia would, for example, ask a reduction of military facilities in Romania or other things that Putin might try to get out of that deal to make any concessions in Ukraine?
That's what Russia wants in the ideal world, but these demands are akin to demands that, Russia withdraws its troops from Ukraine and sends all the war criminals, including Vladimir Putin himself, to The Hague. I don't think that these are very aspirational, lofty goals that were put together in the famous December 2021 ultimatum that President Putin has sent to then US President Joe Biden and his team and other Western capitals. I don't think that this is likely to materialize, and I don't see any reasons for President Trump to give Russia this status of a co-pilot in European security that Russia really doesn't have. It doesn't have capabilities to take all of Ukraine. It doesn't have capabilities to take on NATO at this point. There are some risky scenarios where Russia might be tempted to test NATO's resolve in a smaller country. But overall, I think that there is this big gap and disparity between Russia's lofty aspirations and what Russia can actually do. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. And President Trump has not shown any inclination to give Russia a place in European security larger than it deserves. But on Ukraine, he's been really elusive in saying that, Ukraine's sovereignty and independence is a crucial goal. That's where, if not in its entirety, the principles of the UN Charter need to be upheld, and Russia shouldn't be able to undo a large European neighboring state, even if it's outside of the NATO security umbrella. President Trump has narrowed down his agenda to peace, cessation of hostility, stopping the carnage, and wearing a peace mantle. If that's his agenda, Putin can grant him peace in Ukraine without going after lofty aspirations for European security, but that will probably be enough for now if his goals in Ukraine will be satisfied. A very final point, you asked me what will happen in 2030. Most likely, by 2030, Vladimir Putin will still be in charge in the Kremlin. Donald Trump will not be the president of the United States. It's hard to envisage for me him changing the constitution and staying in power longer. So with that, Vladimir Putin will be able to keep to the promises that he gives to Trump for 4 years. For example, freeze the line of contact, don't push further, and wait for Ukraine to implode and collapse. And if that doesn't happen, keep the option to reinvade. And I think that will be the goal that Team Russia will have in the negotiation undo this opportunity and insurance for the West to protect Ukraine from recurrence of Russia's onslaught?
Let us jump a bit more to the Russian side. From a European and German perspective, Russia is often a black box. If I think back, for example, to the situation when Prigozhin was actually driving towards Moscow and the Kremlin, everybody or many European capitals was shocked. Okay, what is happening there? For you as a true expert on Russia, this might have been not come that much as a surprise. But what would you say is really the status quo in Russia? Is there strong support both in the institutions but also in the population for Putin? Also with the ongoing consequences of the war? And if so, why is this simply the case?
The Kremlin is a black box and remains an increasingly dark box where it's very difficult to penetrate for light. Real-world information, probably, on some issues, like whether Ukraine can be folded into Russia and Russian and Ukrainian people will just accept the Russian rule and be remolded into a different version of Russian. That's Putin's idea and that's his narrative. I think that he's very delusional, and if anything, that this war has brought Ukrainians and Russians further apart, and whether this kind of big crack can be bridged at all is a big question mark. I'm very skeptical, unfortunately, because part of my family was my mother was born in Kiev. A lot of Russians have a lot of family and friendly ties to Ukraine, and what's happening is really heartbreaking on not only on moral level and strategic level, but also on personal level. But yes, the Kremlin is a black box. I think that on my watch, when I was a Kremlin reporter, that was Medvedev's era, and then a little bit of Putin's return era after 2012, it got increasingly more sealed from any outside people who wanted to just really understand of what's going on. It's surprisingly that the US intelligence community had such good insights into the Kremlin's preparation for the war, and not only what was visible for people through satellites and massing of troops and so on, but also very detailed plans. So future historians will probably write about how the US intelligence community knew that. Nevertheless, I think that we are not insured from surprises in Russia. Prigozhin mutiny is a very good case in point. I think that me and my team were seeing that, okay, some trouble is brewing, some rift between Prigozhin and then Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Putin is procrastinating in mending the fences and fixing this power struggle between the two powerful men. And then Prigozhin spending so much time on the front line, getting ideas of what's possible, what's not, and arming this, and having this large armed mercenary group might have ideas. But I think that the march on Moscow and how wobbly the Russian power system will be for 20 hours or so, I think that was unpredictable, and that came not as a shock, but as a surprise for us. However, the fundamentals that secure Putin's position at the helm of the power vertical in Russia are still there. He is not challenged by any of the elite groups. The oligarchs really don't have their own divisions. They don't have their armed private armies. People who control these large armed bureaucracies, the army, police, the internal security service, the FSB, the President Protection Service, are somebody who are very loyal to Putin. They've been selected for loyalty, and they're in conflict with each other. And Putin is the arbiter that really rules through division of these people. And these people are so afraid of each other that just going to a Russian sauna and getting to talk to each other and saying, look, this guy leads our country into a wall. Like, it's a disastrous course. We need to do something together about that. Conversations like that can most likely not happen. The oligarchs are deprived of any means to really influence politics. And then the system has got a lot of tools of repression to atomize the society and to prevent any bottom-up uprising or challenge for the authorities. I will give you one example. In 1991, when the Soviet citizens back then protested use of force in the Baltics republics of the Soviet Union that wanted their independence. On one day, about 500,000 people gathered right in front of the Kremlin. And that was a very powerful signal to the Soviet leaders that, okay, enough is enough. And that was seen as the signal of the upcoming Soviet collapse. It was still not very much in the cards, but that was just a huge demonstration. The largest demonstration on Putin's watch in Moscow, when Alexei Navalny was still alive, in 2012, was 100,000 people for a city with a daytime population of more than 15 million. That's just a fraction of the population. So if you're patient enough, and if you know how to squeeze the civil society, and that's where Putin is very capable, definitely you can outlast them, atomize them, and then imprison and kill them. And that's what they did to Alexei Navalny. So I think that the Russian population is repressed. There is no sense of any real opposition coming from the bottom, and no real cracks in the elite. And if anything, the war has cemented this unity around the flag in the elites. Not that everybody likes what's happening. A lot of people think that this war is horrible, but they have no other choice since they are sanctioned and their money-making sources are all in Russia. And then the population is ever more repressed, ever more prone to propaganda influence, and ever more united in this vision of Fortress Russia.
When we look, for example, to the upcoming elections in Germany, but also in other European countries, how strong would you say is the Russian influence via hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, but also opinion shaping via social media or other platforms, even right-wing parties, left-wing parties, etc.?
The Russians are present. We know that. We have kind of documented evidence of Russians' attempts to interfere in the elections. I think that the most well-documented campaign is really in the United States in 2016 to support Donald Trump and really diminish chances for Hillary Clinton. And the Russians were miraculously successful. But even there, like the exact degree of Russian influence is very hard to establish. But the fact that it came to a reality where an established candidate was losing to a property tycoon who had a very big mouth and very big following on Twitter and really found narratives that were appealing to some constituencies in the United States, that's not of Russia's making. That's definitely are cracks within the fabric of the American society. And I think that it's pretty much the same situation in European politics. Like the popularity of AfD is product of domestic dysfunction, both within Germany, all of the divisions between East and West, all of the economic troubles of recent, the migration flows and so on. There are multiple reasons why people are unhappy with established consensus with the mainstream democratic parties, and some of them vote to fringe right-wing nationalists. And I think that is a pretty European phenomena, more visible in smaller Eastern European countries like Hungary or Slovakia, where we have people like Viktor Orban who've dismantled these various institutions of a more democratic Hungary. And you see like this wave of populism coming to pretty established democracies like the Netherlands or France with popularity of the Front National. So I think that Russia plays a role, but it's also only amplifying the trend lines that already exist in these societies. So if you want to really push back against right-wing populism, you should definitely go after Russian influence operations, but mostly you should address the root causes.
Yeah. The root causes for Putin's success, if we want to say so far, one of them is that the Russian economy did not collapse so far, which was maybe differently expected by, for example, the European Union, analysts in different Western countries. What would you say is the main reason for the surprising strong resilience of the Russian economy so far?
There are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, it's a pretty large economy that has a lot of domestic productions for many key goods that Russia needs for its war effort. There are components that Russia imports. There was deficit of artillery shells because nobody expected that this war will be so much World War One, like not the shock and awe or U.S. invasion of Iraq like. But also agricultural goods. There is a lot of industrial capacity. So a lot of stuff that Russia doesn't need to import. And then what it exports are mostly commodities, oil and gas. Russia exports about 7 million barrels per day. That is a large volume that's nearly impossible to remove from the global markets without disruption. And we live throughout a period of underinvestment into global oil and gas production. So doing without these barrels was nearly impossible. And that's where the sanction program was designed the way that you keep the Russian exports in the market, but try to squeeze the Kremlin's revenue from that. And that's not been very successful because there are also countries that need these hydrocarbons for their own economic development, be it China, be it India. And the discounts that the Russians were able to provide were too lucrative and too attractive for them at the time when Europe and the United States have all canceled purchases from Russia, or de facto canceled. There are still stuff that's coming to Germany, for example, via pretending to be Kazakh oil, but in reality that's Russian oil. But nevertheless, it says that it's Kazakh oil. So the volumes are much smaller. So Europeans had to go to Gulf for both LNG and oil to compensate for phasing out the Russian commodities. And that's where India and China were also left to compete for the same volumes, where the Saudis were not necessarily really ready to open the tap because they were interested in stable and high prices, and they also need to keep part of their production in reserve. That's where Russia really made an offer and a proposition to both India and China as the largest customers that was just too attractive to neglect. And on private businesses, there are already players, be it port, be it private insurers, be it providers of the shadow fleet, that see that, okay, even if you run the risk of being permanently sanctioned by the US and cut off from the international US dollar payments or euro payments, then the chunk of the global businesses with Russian sanctioned oil is so big, it's very likely to stay there. It will not disappear tomorrow. And the risk premiums are so high and so attractive that you're ready to go full in, denying yourself the opportunity to deal with other segments, but that's just enough. You make so much money on this shadowy transactions. And I think that has enabled Russia to get the cash flow out. And then final point is that the Russian central bank and the Russian Ministry of Finance are run by very competent people, unlike the Russian military. So if you're looking for a team inside Putin's government, it's really Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of the central bank, Anton Siluanov, the Minister of Finance, and other people who managed to stabilize the financial system initially and then managed to adapt it so that it can muddle through the current negative trend lines. And over the long horizon, 5-10 years down the road, Russian economy is facing pretty daunting challenges. Its production in terms of extraction of oil and gas will go down. Ultimately, it's already declining by roughly 2 or 3% a year. It doesn't have access to Western technology. It only has access to Chinese technology and is really at the mercy of whether China will provide this technology or not. Its population was not in great shape, and currently, because of the war needs, the population has lost a lot of workers to the battlefield and also to the emigration. The inflation is soaring. And then there is energy transition, though it might be a little bit slower than people have anticipated because of Trump's policies and just overall cooling towards ESG and the urgency of the climate crisis. So Russian economy will not go down and tank, but it's a slow degradation over time and then maybe a war and a much larger crisis 10, 15 years down the road, or maybe even faster. There was a lot of unpredictability. Bad news for Ukraine and for those who hope that Putin can be squeezed into the corner, that for the next 12, 18 months, his state of finance is in okay shape to allow him to continue to finance this war.
So on the long term, there are challenges on the horizons for the economy, but on the short term, it's rather difficult. So if we transfer this to Russian foreign politics, and for example, if we talk to the Baltics or other countries in the nearer neighborhood of Russia, of course, there is very much concern. So would be, if there's not the financial economic power, an attack, for example, on Baltic countries be, in your view, super unrealistic, or might this still be an option for Putin to test how strong the NATO promise actually is?
I think that this is exactly the risk, and you point your finger on a very important issue. Very few people have predicted Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in February 22. Like, we got lucky that the US intelligence knew it, that it was a very competent and steady team that put together various pieces of the puzzle and got the Western world prepared. And even there, everything is contingent. The US intelligence was very conservative in overestimating the Russian military power and underestimating the resilience and nimbleness of Ukrainian defenders. So we are in a much better timeline that Russia overtaken Ukraine in 3 days. But nevertheless, that was not entirely off the table. So very few people have predicted that Putin will go for such a kind of brazen and risky move. And like, when I was still based in Moscow back then, and I remember talking to kind of senior officials and people at the central bank and people in multiple corners of those who had access and would know better. And they say, like, Sasha, it absolutely doesn't make sense. Just make a list of the likely outcomes of our invasion, even if it's successful. Like, probably people will want more US assurances, more US weapons. We will control a territory where there are definitely Ukrainian patriots that hate Russia guts, and that will start a guerrilla fighting just like one we experienced in Afghanistan as Soviet Union, or in Chechnya as Russia. Maybe unthinkable things can happen. Neutral countries like Finland and Sweden would suddenly want to join NATO, right? And that's exactly what was very predictable. So the list of downsides for Russia was very clear, and nevertheless, Putin opted for that. So I can picture you a scenario where 5 years down the road, Ukraine is not fully annihilated, but there is a rump state of Western Central Ukraine. There is an unstable ceasefire. Russia is in the midst of its military reconstitution. Putin believes that he has a very strong, experienced army that knows how to fight the 21st century warfare with all of the drones and modern technology. It's gotten massive help from China. And then there is Trump-like president who is in the midst of challenging Danish sovereignty over Greenland. And there is kind of this narrative that, no protection to NATO allies, or there is a trade war and tariff war between European countries and the US. And then Putin is tempted to test NATO's resolve somewhere in Narva, just to send a division of paratroopers and say, like, oh, Russians have been treated poorly there and I'm just defending their rights, and see what happens. And his little team of people, 5 people, will they tell him, Mr. President, you're crazy. This is a horrible idea. We should never try this. It's too risky. Probably by the time, everybody will be even more yes-saying than they are now. And that's the risk, that there will be no checks and balances and no reality check, that Putin runs of tremendous risk of making a mistake that will have really detrimental consequences. So I wouldn't rule that out. And I think that the focus on deterrence, that Europeans need to reestablish deterrence through investment into their conventional firepower and bring in more reserves, addressing manpower, do collective defense plans that will make this invasion so difficult and so costly that every sane Russian military general will look over the border and say, oh, Mr. Putin, it's not the time. Like, we should definitely postpone that. We are not ready yet.
Yeah. But you put it on the table, so that's actually...
I think that it's very unlikely. I would put the risk of that at single digits, percentage-wise, but it's growing. And I think that when we will reach an unsatisfactory end of this round of fighting in Ukraine, which is likely maybe happening this year, like, we don't know, but it's unlikely that this will be the end of it that will convince Putin that foreign adventurism and armed adventurism against your neighbors is a bad policy tool and does a disservice to Russia and his grip on power. So where his appetites will go, whether he will challenge northern Kazakhstan or whether he will go after arch rival NATO, because it really takes only one country and, like, let's say one city where other NATO countries will say, we are not going to war with Russia over Narva. It's 90% Russian speaking, like, definitely Germans will not die protecting that, or the French or Italians. I think that's where the whole promise of Article 5 is called into question, and you can imagine that large European countries want to discuss their security arrangements with Moscow directly rather in NATO framework. And that means that the results of the Cold War and the whole security architecture that existed in Europe is completely undone, and then it's reestablished more or less on Putin's term. If he's tempted by the price, and if there's nobody to push back internally, and the credible deterrence is not established, the temptation might be too big.
You've mentioned an interesting point, the policy option of dealing directly with the Kremlin, which is also sometimes, again, always debated in German parties, but also in other European countries. So, for example, discussing with Putin the end of the war, having diplomacy instead of military, which is probably a very naive discussion, but still, is this policy option to engage with Putin from a European perspective a valid one? Can it be successful?
I think that talking doesn't mean necessarily agreeing, and then shutting all of the channels of communication with Putin and seeing talking to him as a reward or as acceptance of his horrible actions would not be the right optics. And we know that behind the scenes, through various channels between security services, the Americans and the Russians have been talking throughout the war and managed to accomplish a lot, for example, to make the nuclear scare of fall 2022 less dangerous than it could be if the Americans and the Russians would not be talking to each other and would be just absolutely in complete darkness about each other's plans and risk appetites and calculations, because the risk of accidental collision when nukes are involved is really dangerous. And I think that the US administration was very prudent in talking to the Russians and dispatching Bill Burns, the former director of the CIA, to just handle this profile. So I think that talking is not so bad at all. In general, I understand that the Ukrainians take a very different view. The fear is that the allies will negotiate behind Ukraine's back with Putin, but you can probably find a way to negotiate as one team and use various channels. The problem here is that the level of trust between the West and Moscow has been broken fundamentally, and Putin's outright lies right before the invasion, for example, in Macron's face, when he promised Macron that he will not invade. Macron was emboldened that the peace summit that he wanted to host with Putin, Biden, and Zelensky has legs, where Putin was just about to give order to invade. I think that has left a very lasting impression, and that's not the first and not the last of Putin's lies. And I think that it's also important to understand Putin's perception about that, because if you look at the Minsk agreement, that's lambasted in the West all the time. Yes, it was a deal that was negotiated under a barrel of a gun. But it was a deal that Ukraine agreed to with two European witnesses. and that Russia wanted Ukraine to implement. And since the deal was never implemented, not only on the Russian but on the Ukrainian side as well, Putin felt that he doesn't have other options as to enforce his vision of more subordinated Ukraine, which is an absolutely illegal and immoral and stupid from the Russian strategic vantage point goal, but that was his goal. So his optics about Minsk and about dealings with the West is very much informed by the revelations of former Chancellor Merkel and former French President Hollande, who said, like, well, we thought that Minsk agreement is buying Ukraine time to prepare for the next war and improve its military capabilities, which Ukraine did. So for him, the West was also taking him for a ride, on one hand blessing the Minsk agreement, and on another hand whispering into Ukrainian ears, just don't implement that. That's a bad deal. We will arm you and we will protect you. And I think that with this gap, it's very hard to imagine that diplomacy can be successful in leading to the resolution. It can probably lead to cessation of hostilities at some point, and then hopefully mutual deterrence can be established that will be suboptimal, but will prevent us from recurrence of the war in a kind of larger scale that will involve Russia and NATO directly.
When we look to the broader geopolitical context, we've seen North Korean soldiers fighting on behalf of Russia. We've seen the relationship between Russia and China growing closer, but also, for example, weapon supply from Iran to Russian troops, mostly drones and related stuff. But with this on the one side, and on the other side also seeing that actually democracy in Western societies is more and more under pressure from fake news, social media, disruption within those societies, and we see more autocratic tendencies, one could say. Do you see a new alliance of different countries shaping stronger global order in a different way? So is Russia not as isolated as they may have been a few years ago, because they have influence sometimes within countries, but also new allies which gain in power?
I don't think that the autocracies are forming a real alliance.
Yeah.
The force that's uniting them is called the United States of America. It's the United States of America global power and global definition of its national security interests. Like, point me to a place on the map where the US doesn't have national security interests. It's everywhere. It's the Korean Peninsula, it's the South China Sea, it's Taiwan Strait, it's Iran, it's Eastern Europe, it's South Caucasus, it's everywhere. And then the perception of these authoritarian regimes, shaped by the Cold War practices and post-Cold War behavior of the United States, is that the US is out to get them, to not only limit their rise, maybe, because like countries were probably entertaining ideas to be integrated into sort of benevolent US hegemony, but it threatens their very existence as authoritarian regimes. And as Vladimir Putin was amassing power, and then the Chinese leadership was definitely not thinking about abandoning the communist rule, or Ayatollahs were not thinking about dismantling their regime. Neither was Kim dynasty ready to abandon its grip on the North Korean people. I think that led to the perception that the US is out to get them. It's a mortal enemy that really needs to push back. And then enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's where the first kind of pushes to do more together really provided a glue. And then the second part is that they couldn't care less about the organization of each other's domestic affairs. So I think that that provides a lot of room for very transactional cooperation, united by this common threat perception. Nevertheless, have the Chinese or the North Koreans come to Iranian rescue when Israelis have knocked out their air defenses? Like, it's not happening. It's not an alliance where people will have the same obligations as inside the democratic team, particularly centered around US alliances like NATO, Japan, Australia, and others. The major risk now actually comes not from the authoritarian challenge, but from the Western Bloc itself. And the major disruptor in charge is called Donald Trump. It's the United States of America that tells as the president, and it's very difficult to distinguish the US government and the US president when it says that it wants to have control over Greenland and it doesn't exclude use of military power. I think that sends a shockwaves of how really much you are united by common security interests, by common values, and how trustworthy the strongest partner in this alliance is. So I think that's where the major risk for cohesion of the West really lies right now. We will see how that plays out.
Let us go to the second main part of the podcast, where we look a bit closer on Sino-Russian relations. You've studied this area really for a long time. You really know China also well in their foreign policy, in their domestic policy. How would you say is actually the current state of Sino-Russian relations? Where do you see it?
I think it's deepening, and over the course of the war, we've seen the quantity changing into quality. So it has deepened, and it's also got more asymmetric, where China holds more cards and is a more senior partner. Even before the war, if you zoom out, there were at least 3 fundamental drivers that would keep them into a pragmatic alignment and partnership. They don't have a territorial dispute anymore. They solved that. They decided that, okay, having a contested border is too risky and too costly for them. So since the border has been delimited around 2006, they really diverted their resources elsewhere. And the Russians, given the demographic state of China, that the population is aging rapidly, is not concerned about Chinese populating all of Siberia. So that's one. 2, there is just a natural match made in heaven in terms of economic structures, just like the one Russia and Germany used to have before the war. Russia is a large powerhouse in terms of commodity exports. China is a major consumer of commodities, manufacturing hub, but also powerhouse for technology, investment, and financial resources. And that just makes Russia and China's economic partnership very solid and pragmatic. And then this lack of criticism towards each other's political structures, like whenever Chancellor Scholz or Chancellor Merkel before him goes to China, they need to talk about human rights. They need to raise Taiwan, Xinjiang, and something. Vladimir Putin couldn't care less. And so is Xi Jinping with regard to kind of gay rights in Russia or Chechnya or anything, political prisoners. And I think that on top of that comes this animosity towards the US and the friendship between the two leaders. So comes the war, Russia, before the invasion of Ukraine, still had 40% of its trade with the European Union. Now it's gone. Investment, technological lids, that's all disrupted. And then where does Russia turn to in order to replace the lost revenues? It's both China and India and some other countries, but on technology, investment, financial payments through RMB, the Chinese yuan, that's only China. So China becomes a massive factor in Russian life. It's 40% of Russian imports at least. It's 30% of Russian export revenues. RMB is the major currency that helps Russia to stabilize the ruble exchange rate and trade with other countries. So it becomes really a cornerstone of Russia's ability to keep the country together and keep the economy going. And for China, it's beneficial because it's happening on the Chinese terms, and it's increasingly delivering Russia as a junior partner to China at the time when the Chinese leadership is convinced that the struggle and the competition with the United States is set in stone. It's American choice in their own optics. It's bipartisan consensus, so it doesn't matter whether these are Republican or Democrats. They will try to contain China and limit its rise and outcompete it in AI and all of the emerging technologies by denying Chinese access to these tools in the US. And that's where the power of the US, and that's probably not what the current US president thinks, but that's definitely has been long-term US tradition, relies not only on the strength of the US itself, but its ability to leverage its multiple partnership and like benevolent desire of countries like Japan, Australia, Germany, and others be friends with the United States and help out. China is a very lonely superpower. It's surrounded by countries who are very afraid of China, very skeptical, have historic differences. The partners where it doesn't have that many problems are Pakistan and Laos and Cambodia, like not very consequential countries. Well, Pakistan is large and has nuclear weapons, but it's messy. So Russia is the closest as a resourceful partner that can bring along to the table. Vast nuclear arsenal, indigenous military capabilities that have some advantages in some niche areas over Chinese, where they can bring something to the table. Huge endowment of natural resources that comes across the border, not on vulnerable maritime routes. Ability to cause problem and distraction to the US. So it's a gift that keeps on giving, increasingly on terms defined by China.
So would you say this can actually develop in a stronger, more formal military alliance also between China and Russia, or from China's perspective, there's just no need?
I don't think that China is ready to give Russia type of Article 5 obligations that North Korea, for example, just gave, and that it will be very non-pragmatic for the Chinese to enter a fight with the United States of America or NATO, should Russia, for example, invade Estonia, God forbid, or any other part of NATO or US treaty alliance systems. So China would want to keep its options open. I think so is Russia, to the point. But what's happening is that they're trying to develop interoperability between the two military machines. So you don't have a treaty obligation, but if push comes to shove and you want to have help from your partner, there is practical ability to help each other and fight together, or be helpful to each other in cyber domains, in intelligence collections. And I think these are the new dimensions of their partnership that didn't exist before this war, but are rapidly developing and deepening.
When we talk about tech, we've seen how important, for example, space technology is for the war. Also when Ukraine, in terms of how do I get access to geodata for my artillery, etc. And for example, Starlink has been extremely important for Ukrainian troops, and with, for example, all the cutted cables in the Baltic Sea, and the problem that causes, and the I would say the inferiority of Western critical infrastructure, their weaknesses, and how easily they can be, for example, attacked. Do you see, at least in these domains, space, technology, a stronger alliance emerging between China and Russia, or is it only that Russia is actually really dependent on Chinese technology in these regards?
I think that if the relationship is an iceberg, like this particular areas are increasingly the underwater part of the iceberg, that's large but not visible. We have various data points out there in the media, presumably leaked by Western intelligence agencies, that have data and proofs that China was helpful to the Russians by providing its satellite imagery, for example. We know that Russia is heavily reliant on Chinese microelectronics, including its weapons productions, and like all of the debris of the missiles that the Ukrainians assemble have a lot of Chinese components in them. Well, not only Chinese components, a lot of components come from Europe and the United States still. But nevertheless, we know that there are Chinese components, and the Western components are also coming partially from China. And we know that there's deepened scientific cooperation in civilian sphere. For example, Huawei has tripled its research staff in Russia right before the war. And it was relying on some Russian engineers, particularly around IT, algorithms, applied mathematics, for a very long time. And now, like particularly since a lot of people have been kicked out of joint projects with the Europeans or with the Americans, they either can go to Russia or to the Gulf or to India, but China is definitely very attuned to that development, is trying to lure these people into joint projects with the Russians. So there is a lot of stuff going on. But then This dependency is really, I think, two-sided. There is a lot in military tech that Russia needs from China, where China has clear superiority, particularly in microelectronics and everything what connects modern weapons to chips. But on the other side, in terms of weapons design and engineering, quieter submarines, better engines for the fighter jets, or this radio electronic warfare. Like, you remember that at the very first year of the war, when Western Excalibur artillery shells were delivered, people were amazed, like, oh, this artillery shell is so precise, it can really knock the Russians out. And then in a year's time, it turns out that the success rate is lower because of the Russian countermeasures. So I think that the Chinese are very interested to learn these experiences of the battlefield from the Russians and adapt the technologies that Russians have developed throughout the fighting.
So if this relationship actually develops in various areas and it's quite successful, one could say that, what can actually be a successful, effective Western countermeasure, counter strategy? Where would you start?
At this point, I don't believe in a reverse Kissinger strategy, which is to become more friendly with one of these countries in order to contain the other one. Henry Kissinger and President Nixon famously did that with regard to China in order to improve ties and help to contain the Soviet Union. I think that this is very difficult to do because the relationship between the United States and the West and Russia on one hand and China on the other hand is so deeply fundamental broken. And then Nixon was able to exploit the Sino-Soviet split. We don't see a Russia-China split right now. They're not in fight over territory. They're not in fight over leadership in the communist bloc. There are contradictions as between two powers who are engaged in pragmatic business transactions. There is definitely some struggle for influence in places like Central Asia and so on, but this is not fundamental. And for now, they've managed to resolve these issues or find a way that's mutually accommodating. Mostly where Chinese get the preferential treatment, but nevertheless, that's something where Russia can accept that because also it doesn't have other options. And distrust towards the West is just too detrimental for Russia to improve its behavior. Then Putin is also so deadly obsessed on dismantling Ukraine and challenging the West. So I think that for now, dual containment is something that looks like, oh, it's a strategic nightmare of Henry Kissinger, but that's for now the only viable approach, unless, of course, the United States want to fundamentally rethink the relationships and the organization of the international order and would say like, okay, we stop criticizing each other's domestic politics. You organize your way as you see fit, China and Russia, but we agree that we don't use force against other countries. For example, I voluntarily don't threaten Panama to control the canal, and status quo in Taiwan Strait, no NATO membership for Ukraine, and then we compete, I don't know, who fixes climate challenge first, or who develops safer AI, or who eradicates poverty in Africa. And that's the new kind of way of competition. I don't know how much you like tennis, Timo, but like if there could be competition between Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal, and Djokovic, obviously, but that's not in the cards. It's just too aspirational, and I don't know if we'll live long enough to see something like that ever happening. So since both sides want to outcompete the other, like China wants to probably be a hegemon in the Asia Pacific without concern and take Taiwan without de facto or for military force or more for force of coercion. The US wants to deny that. Both sides want to dominate the emerging technologies. Russia wants to dominate its immediate neighborhood. As long as that's the case, dual containment seems to be the only viable approach from the West. However, I would say that after Putin, whether the next generation of Russian leaders, even if they come from the same breed of people who were selected by Putin and for whom the shaping experience was fighting the West, whether they will find that, okay, being a junior partner of China, increasingly on Chinese terms, is something that Russia is happy with. It's something that really delivers for long-term prosperity of security, and whether trying to find a more balanced relationship with China and the West and just not move away from China and join Team West. That's very unlikely to happen anytime soon, if ever, but just to arrive at more balanced relationship. I think that here it's also where a lot of Western agency is, whether it can find a way to imagine a policy that's not accommodating to Russian demands, but that's more pragmatic and where you move towards just a more peaceful forms of competition and coexistence rather than one dangerous and horrible that we're having now.
You've briefly mentioned also AI, artificial intelligence from...
I'm out of my depth, but if you push me against the wall, I will need to talk something about that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, at least parts of the tech world have been very surprised by the capabilities of DeepSeek. So a Chinese success in developing actually capable AI, which comes close to US capabilities like ChatGPT or related other models, AI models in the US. And this despite the US efforts to try to keep key technologies and semiconductors, which are very narrow, smaller than 2 nanometers, etc., away from China. So in terms of this technological race, where do you see China heading? Is China actually more capable than the Western or the US anticipated, also militarily? Or do you still think or do you see still a very strong tech supremacy by the US, but China is getting close to it step by step? Or what is your take on the current domestic development and economically, but also of course technology driven in China?
I know very little about AI and I'm out of my depth, but here are my 5 cents. I think that there is a lot of investment over time in China into indigenous capabilities to produce modern chips. You see a lot of effort around the Shanghai semiconductor manufacturers, the interest in importing ASML, the Dutch photolithography machines, and to really invest into the next generation localization and indigenous production. I think that the results are mixed, but not that China will just accept that it will always be the second to the US. And if the US bans certain types of goods to be exported to China, that, okay, we need to abandon our hopes to be on par with the US and be able to compete. So I think that there will be both ability to circumvent some of the restrictions and get equipment in. There will be a lot of investment into the hardware. There will also be a lot investment into brain power. And that, I think, is also crux of the issue, because the American idea is that because of diversity of our workforce and because of the competitive landscape, we always will be one step ahead. But if you look at different types of technology, and again, I'm illiterate, but here's my metaphor. If you would compare Soviet fighter jets and the Western fighter jets, right? They have fought each other in Korean War and in Vietnam War to an extent, with mixed result. Like Soviet jets managed to shoot down the Americans and vice versa. So, and the Soviet jets were developed in a system where various state-owned plants and engineering teams were artificially competing with each other. So it was not a market economy, but it was still a competition. In China, the same exists, because like the economy is state-dominated, but it's largely private and market-driven. And I can imagine that there is a lot of Chinese, very sophisticated talent with Western PhDs, with Chinese PhDs, and now the Russians are also part of this intellectual mix. A lot of Russian mathematicians are part of Chinese teams working on AI. So with that, you have a lot of asymmetric, and that's what we read about DeepSeek, is that the way that chips talk to each other and the way that the task is distributed into kind of smaller parcels, and the whole architecture around problem solving is different. And even with kind of less powerful chips, you can deliver. Final point here is that it's not only about the ability of one chip, but it's also about the computing power. So more inexpensive older generation chips can give you the same amount of compute. And then if you have like thousands of older chips and they are cheaper than this several of cutting edge chips, well, you can put a lot of cutting edge chips, but that costs money. So bang on a buck can be different even with legacy chips. I think that the size of the chip is really important for some implications that we might see. For example, very small drones that will take some payload, and that's where the size and weight of the chip is really important for how long it will fly and how much kinetic power it will have. But like these are really some of the very niche, small scale usages, right, and applications that we are far from. And then the other part is also investment into hard infrastructure. The power to process all of this data and electricity required for that, investment into hardware, data storage, and so on, is really where a lot of effort of Microsoft and Google is, and that's what the Chinese companies are also doing. And if they have access to cheap Russian gas and cheap Russian natural resources and can locate their data storage facilities in Russia where it's colder and it requires less electricity to cool them down, I think that's where this partnership with Russia also brings some technological advantage or competitive advantage to the Chinese in this AI arms race. It's marginal, but it's probably important.
We're getting closer to the end, but there are two questions on China I wanted to briefly at least discuss with you. The first is the Arctic, also on the Greenland debates, also about critical minerals, etc., military influence. With regard to the Arctic, could that be also an area of closer cooperation between China and Russia? And the second one, which related to that question, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, there have been ups and downs. Do you think now also with Russia and China cooperating closer in different areas that this will also lead the Belt and Road Initiative again to a stronger point for an anti-Western grasp on the world?
On the Arctic, China is there already.
Yeah.
China defines itself as a near-Arctic state. It's outside of the Arctic Council. And before the war, the interest of all of the Arctic Council countries was really to keep the non-Arctic countries out as observers that sit there without any voice to shape the Arctic agenda. But now the Russian membership is really put on ice. Sorry for the pun. And I think that when people say, oh, the Russians will be there in technical discussions on, climate change and indigenous people, but we don't provide them right to be politically there because it's unacceptable. Well, the Russians have zero interest then to participate in these collective forms of governance. And what has also changed for the Russians is that it used to be Russia, NATO countries, and at least two neutral countries, Finland and Sweden. Now it's Russia versus NATO in the Arctics. Russia is also squeezed economically and technologically. So if it wants to develop its Arctic resources, the only country that comes to rescue, that has resources, the shipbuilding capacity, the demand for the hydrocarbons and other resources that could be extracted, the capabilities to ship goods to Europe through the Northern Sea route, is only China. And China is already there. It's the largest investor into Yamal LNG and Arctic LNG plants. And I think that we're going to see more of that. Because for China, that's also the most natural inroad into the Arctic other than other NATO countries. So I think that that is already happening and we're going to see more of that. And I would not be surprised at some point to see not only commercial element, but security element. On Belt and Road is a brand. It's not a strategy. A lot of the projects that are branded as part of Belt and Road, like Port of Gwadar, have been long in the making before the words like Idai Ilu, like One Belt, One Road, dropped out of Xi Jinping's mouth. So it's really a branding strategy for doing like outward direct investment and infrastructure project and trade facilitation agreements that are knit together and branded as Xi Jinping's foreign policy, just like this peaceful rise was Hu Jintao's brand of foreign policy. And it's more focused on infrastructure, it's something material and attractive. So China chased a lot of countries to sign these MOUs and to become part of Belt and Road unofficially, but actually China invested much more money still before the rift into developed markets that have never been part of Belt and Road symbolically and has built infrastructure there without calling it Belt and Road. So I think that people get agitated. Our American colleagues get all up in arms through successive Democratic and Republican administrations. They push back, they create alternatives, they hate the brand. And like, for example, one of the concessions that Panama made to Trump's team is to walk out of the memorandum of Belt and Road. I think that's immaterial. That's kind of a bruise on the pride and sensibility of Xi Jinping and Chinese leadership. But the much more consequential thing will be if Hutchison Whampoa, the Hong Kong shipping company, kind of port management company, will be kicked out of managing the canal. I think that will be much more painful for the Chinese. And overall, I think that the Chinese leadership has discovered that this brand Belt and Road is causing a lot of allergic reaction by the West, a lot of unnecessary attention. So my impression is that it's gradually put on the back burner. It's still there, they hold the summits, but Chinese foreign policy is not all about Belt and Road anymore. And like all of these new concepts of security and civilizational initiative and all of that, like that's the newer brand of Xi Jinping's foreign policy that's much more important for China symbolically than Belt and Road.
Sasha, thank you so much for both your takes on Russia and your take on China, but specifically also the Chinese-Russian relationship. One last question for you. If you would have to sit down with Vladimir Putin for dinner and you ask him an uncensored question and he would actually he must answer truthfully, what would be your question to him? He can't avoid the question, he has to answer.
I have many. I think that one would be his truthful assessment of whether the war in Ukraine has made good for Mother Russia or not, and whether he just sees the downsides, and like, ask him if he is forced to do that to walk me about his honest thinking about the downsides. That's one. Bigger, more philosophical question is, Mr. Putin, imagine if you stepped down and retired from politics in 2008. You would be the president that pacified Chechnya through a lot of brutality, but really stopped this war. You doubled the Russian GDP. You made Russia pay down its debt and be on path for tremendous prosperity, maintain tremendous internal openness that was unparalleled to Tsarist Russia and to Soviet times. So the level of prosperity and security and freedoms under your first terms was unprecedented. So if you would step down and retire, you would be remembered as the father of the nation and you would still be more impactful politician. Why have you not retired? And are you regretting staying in charge? Like his truthful answer and thinking about that would be really interesting. That's why I don't think that Putin doesn't give any uncensored Interviews anymore, other than Tucker Carlson.
Das war Alexander Gabuev in der 26. Folge des Podcasts The Future of Power.
Herzlichen Dank.
Danke dir.
Nächstes
Sascha.
Mal auf Deutsch.
Nächstes Mal auf Deutsch, ein großes Vergnügen und unseren Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörern ganz herzliches Ein ganz herzliches Dankeschön fürs Dabeisein und die nächste Folge folgt dann wie gewohnt in